When Russian prisoners of war returned home after the end of the Second World War, you would expect they would be treated as heroes. After all, these were the men who had risked their lives to fight for their country to be free from Hitler. That's not what happened. Russian leader Joseph Stalin sent them to labor camps or had them executed. His view was that if these men had been taken prisoner alive, that meant they must have surrendered. If they'd surrendered, that meant they were traitors. And if they were traitors, they deserved to die. This even applied to his own son, who was captured by the Nazis. They offered him to Stalin in a prisoner exchange, but Stalin refused and his son was executed. Everybody feared Stalin. In his purges, he killed even people who had shown nothing but loyalty to him and to communism. However, while he was feared and committed many acts of evil, Stalin's achievements are astonishing. Under him, Russia was transformed from a nation humiliated and crippled by the defeat in World War I to a superpower, victorious over Nazi Germany and in control of 1/6 of the world's land. The Soviet Union became the second most powerful state on the planet. Stalin was also a political genius. In 1917, at the time of the Russian Revolution, Lenin was in command and Stalin wasn't the obvious choice for who would succeed him. By 1925, through Machiavellian political maneuvering, Stalin had dispatched with all his rivals and was the undisputed leader of Russia. He concentrated power so much that even people who had been crucial in the Russian Revolution were stripped of their positions or executed. Whether for the 10 million people that he killed or the vast communist empire that he built, there can be no doubt that Joseph Stalin was one of the most important men in history. Stalin was born in 1878 in the small city of Gori, which is now in Georgia, but at the time was part of the Russian Empire. In school, his performance was exceptional. His teachers were astonished at his incredible memory, and he ended up graduating 2 years early. At the age of 16, he won a scholarship to study at the seminary, a religious school in the capital of Georgia. This gave Stalin an opportunity that few people had. The vast majority of people were condemned to be peasants, but Stalin was on track to become a priest. However, this future wasn't to be. Even at this young age, it was possible to see that he was a lot more interested in the work of Marx and Engels than in the Bible. After 5 years at the seminary, Stalin left and joined the revolutionary underground. He gave classes in socialist theory and encouraged many men to take strike action, which drew the attention of the Tsar's secret police. They attempted to arrest Stalin in 1901, but he escaped and went into hiding, evading arrest by using aliases and sleeping in different apartments. He continued to organize workers' strikes and demonstrations until April of 1902, when the authorities finally succeeded in arresting him, and he was sentenced to 3 years in exile in Siberia. The next 12 years of Stalin's life followed a similar pattern. He would be arrested, sent to Siberia, and then bribe his way out. This happened at least 6 times, and while Stalin always managed to escape, he wasn't making much progress in bringing about communism in Russia. At this point, he's about 35 and has spent most of his adult life fighting the Tsarist regime with little to show for it. In another era, Stalin would have simply continued fighting until he died, and we would never have heard of him. But in Russia, in the early 1900s, there was a discontent that made the country a powder keg, and it was going to explode with an unimaginable ferocity. It's at this point that we need to take into account the broader context of what was happening in Russia in the early 1900s. For over a century, the country had been failing to keep up with Western Europe, both in terms of wealth and political rights. The standard of living was much lower than in industrial powerhouses like the UK or Germany. Many of the peasants that farmed the land were effectively slaves, and as a result there was huge anger at the status quo. This was further exacerbated by the humiliating defeat in the war with Japan in 1905. The failure in that war led to revolution and a new constitution, and for the first time in Russian history, the Tsar was forced to share power with the parliament. This new, more liberal Russia might have survived, but only 9 years later, in 1914, Russia found itself embroiled in World War I. Ultimately, this was more than the fragile state could take. Again, the military performed badly, and again Russia was humiliated. Tsar Nicholas was asked by his generals to abdicate, and he did so, naming his brother as heir. Unfortunately though, in one final act of incompetence, Nicholas abdicated without first consulting his brother. His brother wasn't interested in becoming Tsar and refused, and with that, Nicholas II had unintentionally made Russia into a republic. Power was now split between the government already in power and the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, that wanted Russia to be communist. The situation was hugely unstable, and later that year Russia had a second revolution, which saw the Bolsheviks take power. A 5-year civil war ensued that saw the death of 10 million people, but ultimately it was the Bolsheviks that were now in charge of Russia. When the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, Stalin is just one of many revolutionaries that surround Lenin. Nobody would have guessed that it would be Stalin that would become Lenin's successor. Not to mention, Lenin himself was only 47, so it was conceivable that he would go on to lead the Soviet Union for decades to come. However, unbeknownst to everyone at the time, in a few short years, Lenin would be incapacitated due to poor health. This led to a power struggle for who would succeed him, and it's during this period that Stalin demonstrated himself to be a true political genius. Through cunning and ruthlessness, Stalin beat off all those rivals and emerged as the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. In time, those rivals would all be assassinated by Stalin. This raises the question, how did Stalin do it? How did he outsmart all the other Soviet revolutionaries and become all-powerful? The key moment in his rise to power happened in 1922 when Lenin appointed him General Secretary of the Communist Party. Initially, Stalin was disappointed with the role, having wanted a more prestigious ministerial position. However, he quickly learned how to expand the power of the role. He prepared the agenda for meetings, meaning that he got to decide what was discussed. He got to appoint new local leaders, and he filled all those roles with people loyal to him, establishing a network of allies. Just a few weeks after Stalin was made General Secretary, Lenin had the first of several strokes, and from that day onward, his involvement in governing was greatly diminished. Stalin's main rival was Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was a hugely important figure. He had played an instrumental role in the Russian Revolution and had been in charge of the Bolshevik army during the Civil War. He was an incredible orator and was more famous than Stalin amongst the common people. He also used his way with words to undermine Stalin. He invented disparaging nicknames for Stalin. He called him the outstanding mediocrity of the party, the gravedigger of the revolution. This all got under Stalin's skin. He needed to strip Trotsky of his power, so he allied with two other important revolutionaries, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Both these men would later be assassinated by Stalin, but for now they were useful to get rid of Trotsky. This worked, and Trotsky was gradually stripped of all his positions, eventually being exiled from the Soviet Union. With Trotsky gone, Stalin now just had to dispatch with the two men who had helped him, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Again, he allied with third parties to outmaneuver them. There were show trials, and they were forced to confess to crimes that they hadn't committed. Stalin promised that if they pled guilty, they would be able to live, but within hours of their conviction, Stalin ordered their execution. They were executed that night by firing squad. It's important to note that Stalin was, to a large degree, elevated to the top by those around him. People recognized that he had skills that they didn't, and they respected how he worked night and day. For someone with so much power, he lived a modest lifestyle and took few mistresses. Ultimately, Stalin was in charge of everything: the military, domestic policy, international relations, culture. People around him recognized that he was the only one with the capacity to take on so much. Another reason Stalin managed to rise to power was that he had an exceptional ability to turn on the charm when he needed to. In the words of one historian, Charm is how Stalin built his dictatorship. If he set his mind to charm you, he was irresistible. Even Winston Churchill, who was no doubt a fine judge of character, wrote in a letter to his wife, "The more I get to know the Great Bear, the more I like him." While huge numbers died in Stalin's purges, it was the collectivization of agriculture and the ensuing famine that killed the most people. The term collectivization of agriculture may sound obscure and technical, but in practice what it meant was the enslavement of 100 million peasants. These peasants were still obliged to work long hours producing food, but now, like slaves, they no longer owned what they produced. In the early part of Stalin's reign, there was communism only in the cities, with capitalism amongst the farmers. When the Soviets had first come to power, they had tried to implement communism in the countryside, but it had led to a terrible famine in 1921, and so Lenin had allowed some private ownership of land in order to stop the famine. This worked. Food production increased, and the Soviet Union got back to the level of production that it had had before World War I. However, this meant that there was a twofold system, with communism only in the cities and capitalism in the countryside. One of Stalin's main priorities was to change this and implement communism in the entire country. In other words, even though capitalism was working to produce enough food, Stalin was so determined to implement communism that he was willing to risk changing the system, with disastrous consequences. Everyone else in government wanted the collectivization to happen, but many were concerned about how it would be done. How would the land be confiscated? Wouldn't it destabilize the regime? The scale of the challenge was enormous. There were 100 million peasants spread over 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, and this was at a time where communications were very slow and primitive. Many in the government were reluctant to go ahead because they were so fearful that it would be a disaster and potentially lead to another revolution. It's now that we see the astonishing strength of personality of Joseph Stalin. No other person in the regime would have been able to do it, although all of them wanted it to happen. The collectivization of agriculture started in 1928 and lasted about 5 years. Land was confiscated from private owners and all food production happened on large state-owned farms. Peasants were ordered to hand over all their grain since it was now the property of the state. This led to people hiding the grain so that it couldn't be confiscated, and so government officials would search the peasant houses for any grain that might be hidden. For these people that lived in poverty, this grain that they had farmed was all that they had, but they were powerless to stop the government officials from seizing it. In some places, the peasants resisted the process. They saw the collectivization as a second serfdom like they had endured during the Tsarist regime. Sometimes, after the grain had been confiscated, angry mobs would storm the storage buildings and take it back. Ultimately, collectivization turned out to be worse than anyone could have imagined. Roughly 6 million people starved to death and 60 million are malnourished but survive. People become so desperate that they resort to cannibalism, with more than 2,500 people convicted for eating other humans. The Soviet regime printed posters declaring, "To eat your own children is a barbarian act." Stalin knew about the suffering going on and made some small concessions. The amount of grain confiscated from some regions was reduced, and he released a small amount of food aid. The famine was particularly bad in the Ukraine, where it became known as the Holodomor. Today, a few countries class the Holodomor as a genocide, and some historians believe that the famine was deliberately exacerbated by Stalin. He might have done this to eliminate a Ukrainian independence movement. Politically, the collectivization was a disaster for Stalin. Various party members began to criticize him behind his back. Stalin survived because his inner circle remained loyal to him. If they had abandoned him, it would have been the end of his dictatorship, but instead they stood by him. They knew that there was nobody else that could lead the country, and they were also complicit in the crime. They knew that if Stalin fell, they might also be subject to punishment. The whole episode had a huge effect on Stalin's psychology. He knew how close he had come to losing power, and it fed into his paranoia for the rest of his life. Gradually, the collectivized farms find a way to produce enough food, and by 1934, the famine is over. Stalin is now a hero, having managed to successfully bring communism to the entire country. Only 2 years later, in 1936, Stalin begins the Great Purge. While it was peasants unassociated with politics that bore the brunt of the famine, in the Great Purge, Stalin's wrath was directed at members of government. He murdered his military officers, his diplomats, his intelligence officials, his party officials. It's important to emphasize that these are the elites, the people most loyal to Stalin and the regime. These are the people who stuck with Stalin throughout the disastrous collectivization of agriculture. Whilst many in government lost their lives in the Great Purge, it would be wrong to think that these were the only victims. Roughly 1 million people were killed in the Purge, and they came from all walks of life. Of all the events of Stalin's life, the Great Purge is one of the hardest to explain. One possible explanation is that Stalin wanted to break the will of his inner circle. Up until that point, many of those surrounding Stalin had been willing to debate him, to have their own ideas. After the Great Purge, these people were psychologically broken and many committed suicide. Stalin was ramping up the level of fear amongst those around him and demonstrating his power. One of the unique aspects of Stalin's purge was the emphasis on obtaining confessions from people before they were executed. It wasn't just enough to kill someone. Stalin wanted them to confess to crimes that they hadn't committed. He was directly involved in this. He would receive drafts of the confessions before they were made public. He would even edit them, adding information about imaginary crimes. An example of this is the case of a man called Mikhail Tukhachevsky. He was one of the most senior army officers and their most talented military commander. Tukhachevsky was forced to confess that he was a German spy. This was, of course, preposterous, but it served its purpose. His handwritten confession still exists on blood-stained paper from where he was tortured. So why did Stalin do this? The confessions were useful as they legitimized the arrests and the executions. It also increased the number of people that were arrested because each suspect was forced to name accomplices and they too could then be arrested. The confessions were also useful to generate fear and suspicion amongst the common people. The message was that there are enemies of Russia everywhere and that you can trust nobody except, of course, Stalin himself. The Great Purge ended in 1938, only 1 year before the start of World War II. With the rise of Hitler, Stalin knew that there was a danger of a war between the two countries. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf about how Slavs were lesser humans and how he hated communism. Stalin wanted to do everything he could to avoid a war with Germany. The ideal would be if the evil capitalists, Britain, France and Germany, could go to war with each other and wipe each other out. This was the origin of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and when it was signed, it seemed like a huge success for Stalin. Not only had he avoided war with Germany, he had secured trade with it, where Russia would supply raw materials and in exchange would buy state-of-the-art German weapons. On top of all of that, Russia got to take a huge chunk of Poland. The pact was signed on the 23rd of August, 1939, and as you can see from the photos, Stalin was really rather pleased. When World War II broke out just 1 week later, it seemed like Stalin was getting exactly what he wanted, a war that would destroy the capitalists. However, France fell in only 6 weeks, which wasn't what Stalin had wanted. What he had wanted was a long, drawn-out war, like World War I, where both sides would completely exhaust themselves. The fall of France was also concerning because of what it implied about the power of the German military. In World War I, France had been able to hold off the Germans, while now it had been defeated in just 6 weeks. Russia had lost to Germany in World War I, so would they even stand a chance now? As 1941 approached, the Germans amassed a huge military build-up on the border with Russia. The Russians believed that the Germans wouldn't invade, so when they did, the Russians were taken totally off guard. The Russians were so unprepared that on the first day of the invasion, as German troops flooded across the border, a Russian train entered Germany carrying supplies for the Germans. All this begs the question, how was Stalin so unprepared for the German attack? After all, there were people that had warned him. It was in part due to disinformation spread by the Germans about what the troop build-up was for. There was disinformation stating that the troops were there to attack British forces in Iran. There was other disinformation stating that Hitler was just going to blackmail Stalin, that he would demand money and threaten to invade if it wasn't paid. This disinformation was also believed by British intelligence, so the Russians weren't the only ones fooled by it. It's important to remember just how crazy it was for Hitler to attack the Soviet Union, and people at the time recognized that it would be crazy, so they were predisposed to think that Hitler wouldn't attack the Soviet Union. The Germans were initially very successful, and soon Ukraine, Belarus and the Baltic states were taken, Leningrad was under siege, and bombs were falling on Moscow. The Russian defense was partly hampered by the fact that Stalin had killed many experienced officers in the Great Purge. Stalin's response was to conduct the war effort with a total willingness to lose as many Russian troops as was necessary. He implemented a scorched earth policy and ordered his soldiers to fight to the death, labeling anyone taken prisoner a traitor. The most famous example of this was Order 227, with the line "not a step back." It ordered that if Russian soldiers retreated, they would be shot by troops stationed behind them. This willingness to sacrifice Russian men resulted in the loss of 11 million soldiers, which is twice as many as was lost by Germany and 20 times as many as the United States. The turning point of the war was the Battle of Stalingrad. The Russians lost more men, but they had a lot more men to lose, and so came out victorious, and the Germans were on the defensive for the rest of the war. As the German army collapsed, the Red Army engaged in the mass rape of women in the conquered territory. Stalin refused to punish the rapists, and when he was challenged on it, his response was to say, "After experiencing the traumas of war, how can a soldier react normally? What is so awful about him having fun with a woman after such horrors?" Westerners like myself are often surprised that Stalin is still a popular figure in Russia. After all the people he killed, how can he still be remembered fondly? The answer, very simply, is the victory over Nazi Germany. World War II remains the biggest war ever fought, and Stalin was in power at the time. He wasn't just in power, he was a despot, so he had total responsibility for everything that happened. Russia lost the war with Japan. It lost the First World War. But then, under Stalin, it won the Second World War. Stalin lived for 8 years after the end of the Second World War, and these years were some of the most consequential. It quickly became clear that the USA and the Soviet Union were now opponents, involved in a struggle for influence over the earth, with the USA promoting capitalism and the Soviet Union promoting communism. As the Red Army had pushed the Nazis out of Eastern Europe, they had remained in those countries. Stalin repeatedly promised that he would refrain from the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, but ultimately that's exactly what he did. The task wasn't easy. He had to be authoritarian enough with these countries that they wouldn't break free from his power, but not so brutal as to provoke a war with the West. He decided not to merge these countries into the Soviet Union, but rather recognize them as officially independent nation states, but then used vote rigging to install puppet governments. They would remain under Soviet influence for another 4.5 decades. In Germany, Stalin controlled just the eastern part, with West Germany a separate capitalist nation. Stalin wanted Germany to be unified, hoping that it would come under Soviet influence, but the USA and the UK were opposed to this. So Stalin tried to force their hand by blockading West Berlin. The United States responded by airlifting supplies to Berlin, and Stalin eventually relented. In Asia, Stalin aided the communists in the Chinese Civil War, leading to the victory of the Chinese Communist Party. This might be one of the biggest parts of Stalin's legacy, as China being communist still has a huge effect on geopolitics to this day. Stalin also supported North Korea when it invaded South Korea in 1950, and they very nearly took control of the entire Korean peninsula. At home, Stalin remained as brutal as ever. The Gulag system of labor camps was expanded, and by 1953, 3% of the Soviet population was imprisoned or in exile. There was yet another major famine in 1946, which left 1 million dead, and just like in previous famines, it was exacerbated by Stalin continuing to export food even as his own citizens starved. Stalin also remained as paranoid as ever. In 1952, several doctors were arrested for allegedly plotting to kill politicians in what became known as the Doctors' Plot. Stalin had them tortured to get confessions from them. It was eventually declared that the whole thing had been a fabrication. By 1950, Stalin was now in his 70s and his health was failing, leaving him less and less able to work. He would take increasingly long holidays, sometimes as long as 5 months, but he refused to retire. He even arrested a doctor that advised that he retire for the sake of his health. Finally, on the 1st of March 1953, Stalin was found barely conscious on his bedroom floor. He had had a stroke. He remained on his couch for 3 days as various medicines and even leeches were applied to him. He died soon after, and his body was embalmed and placed on display in Moscow. There were enormous crowds wanting to see the body, so much so that 100 people died in a human crush. Many things changed in the Soviet Union immediately following Stalin's death. There was an amnesty for non-political prisoners, halving the number of prisoners in the country. Torture was banned, and the purges were greatly reduced. 3 years after Stalin's death, the new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a speech sharply critical of Stalin and the purges. Despite this, Stalin remained popular, and even today, many Russians have a favorable view of him. Ultimately, he was the man that won them the war.
Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.